Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Faculty of Emergency Nursing MFEN lecture. You get 3 this month because there are 5 Thursdays in March this year. So you've had 2 lectures already this month. This is your 3rd, and then you should also have had the opportunity to attend the monthly webinar that Gary Jones gave us on the history of emergency nursing, and the assessors webinar, which our past president and current president Judith Morgan and Claire McCarthy will have led. So I get the potentially somewhat dry subject of writing a policy for you this evening. Now, writing policies is not, we all know, the most exciting thing. But the problem is it's very, very necessary. And it's only when you don't have a policy or when you find a policy gap that you appreciate why we need a policy. So once you get to the level where you are expected to be in charge regularly, you're starting to take a lead on a shift or section basis. Perhaps you've been given lead responsibility for a particular part of the department or particular type of care given within the department. At some point, someone will say, can you revise the policy? Can you write the policy? Can you write a procedure? Can you write a guideline? So actually, it's really important you know how to do all of those things. And we're going to start with writing a policy. And then on the 28th of April, which is your next MFEN lecture, after a 2-week break for Easter, 28th of April, Marianne Jenkins is going to do writing a procedure and a standard operating procedure. So off we go. Usual rules apply. She says, looking for the forward arrow. Obviously, we know this is being recorded and it will be made available for catch up for those registered for the session. Everyone's asked to keep themselves on mute so we don't have any howl around or echoes or anything of that ilk. And if you want to speak, holding down your space bar is a really easy way to come off mute. Use the chat function, please, to input or ask or answer questions. And we'll answer questions as we go along, or we'll follow up later depending on when you ask the question. Struggling with reception, turn your camera off. And as ever, we ask you not to share the codes for the MFEN sessions or the recordings unless you've had our prior permission to do so. Okay. So, given that you're kind of anticipating a bit of a suite of these, this is the first of some lectures on getting policy and procedures in place. So, by the end of the 2-hour lecture that you are listening to now or watching on catch up later, you should have a clear understanding of the function and purpose of policies, the benefits of having a policy. I did look up whilst preparing this lecture, life without policies, and came across a lot of little sayings that were going, life is better without rules. So I hope to convince you it isn't, because having everyone working to the same rules is much quicker. Then we need to have a look at how to write a good policy, and I make no apology for the fact that this is a bit nuts and bolts. It's deliberately nuts and bolts, and that's because you need to work through getting things right. If you can read a policy quickly and understand it, then you've written a good one. But if you have to go through and you go, do you know what, page 43, really? Oh, help. What did it say on page 51? 51. Oh, is there a 51 as well? Oh, dear. It's important we write good policies that people can get the gist of and that they make sense to them. Then we need to have a think about how to introduce a policy and something on the problems that arise due to lack of a policy. So we'll see whether I've managed to achieve that. Excuse me. Okay. Now, everyone talks about policies and procedures. So what's the difference? Which comes first, chicken or egg? And look, these two images are the exact reverse. One's got policies underneath procedure. The other one's got policies above procedure. Which way around should it be? Well, it sort of depends which way you're looking at it. If you're thinking of it in a pyramid term, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs style, then you probably want policies along the bottom. But there is a layer below on which you put everything. Or if you're thinking of top-down management are decreeing how the organisation will work, then maybe policies is at the top and everything else is below it. So it depends which way round you want to think of it. But policies and procedures do seem to be linked inextricably, that in people's language and in their frame of reference, you don't talk about policy on its own. You usually say policies and procedures. So what is a policy? Let's do the needful thing at the beginning of a lecture and define what we're talking about. A policy is a course or principle of action which is adopted or proposed by an organisation or an individual, because it could be an individual, or indeed it could be a government. We're coming up to some local elections in May 2022. Of course, I'm not going to make a comment on that, other than to say, when you're being asked to cast your vote, each of the parties will present their policies. That's their course of action that they are proposing if you vote them in. So if you vote for a candidate in an election, they should have some policies that tell you, this is what I will do if you vote for me. Now, we all know it doesn't quite work out that way, but you've got to start with something, and that's what they're proposing. Or you could look at a policy as a document that contains instructions that says how things are done here. So I've got, after the break, I've got an example for you, a real example. And as I was choosing my example, I've chosen it for a specific reason, but it was really interesting that this example says how things are done. So very much straight down the line statement of the way we will do things. So think of it as an overarching statement, or often they run to a bit more than 2 sentences. So it's more than an overarching sentence, but a statement, like you might make a press statement. This is our statement of what we will do, how we will do it. This is our offer. Now, if you care to do a Google search or 3 of policy, you might come across the 4 Ps. That's policy, process, procedure, props, one at a time from the top. So policy, as we have just looked at it, is this is how we will do it. Process is this is how we're going to get from the start to the end. And processes are either working left to right or top to bottom. And you'll see that in lots of flow charts that people go, all right, there's the flow chart. Right, let's just work our way through. That's the process. That's how we should be able to get through from that point to that point. So you may have been asked to process map things. If you haven't, you have that joy yet to come. But when you process map, fancy management speak for write down what you do in the order you do it. Don't make any assumptions about it. And usually when you're process mapping, somebody will facilitate that who doesn't do your job. And they'll ask the dumb questions about, well, what happens there? Do you do that? And they'll notice the things you've missed because something won't make sense to them as they work through the process. And so that can really help. And people can get quite hung up on the precision of this. If you are having any changes made to your IT systems, for example, IT types will want a process map that details exactly what steps you have to do in what order, and are you happy with that? And is there a variation on anywhere there? Right. Okay, so that's process, but it's not policy. And then procedure. So that's where we get told the detail on how we want each section carried out. Okay, so that might be procedure for suturing or wound closure, or it might be procedure for requesting investigations. You know, right, I want this investigation. So to do that, I've got to fill in a referral form to the right person, and then I've got to put it here, or I've got to press submit, and then I've got to wait for this, or I've got to prepare the patient that way. And it will be step by step exactly what must be done to make sure that we get what we need at the end. There's also things called standard operating procedures. But Marianne's going to do procedures and standard operating procedures on the 28th of April. So I'm just going to gloss over that now and say, Marianne will tell you all about procedures. And then props. Now, let's be honest, that's just a convenient P and a convenient word to make it go 4 Ps. But what it's talking about there is the different component tools you need to make the procedures work. So I'm just doing a piece of work in our trust that needs several bits to be working. So I need risk assessments working. I need a checklist in several places that needs to be working and sorted. I need certain things to be available. So the pharmacy ordering system needs to work. When we get it all on the intranet, the hyperlinks all need to work. So the things that you need underneath to make all the procedures work must be in place. That might also be where you have guidelines. That, you know, here's your guideline on how to do this. So simple stuff. I've got a patient who's had an epileptic fit. It's their first fit. What do I do now? So the procedure is referrals. The tools there are the referral forms, your referral system. These days, most trusts have an e-referral system. Great. I don't have to look for the bit of paper. I just have to find the place on the intranet. I'm not sure which takes longer these days, but anyway. So the props are the individual documents, but nothing works without all of the pieces being in the puzzle. And you'll find that if you're missing something, you'll trip over it quite quickly. So here we are. That's in visual form. For those of you who like visual formatting, here you go. Policy is the bottom of your triangle there. Standards, they've put standards on this diagram. I haven't talked about them because they don't start with a P, but you can have standards in the UK, we generally have standards that are dictated by the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. They have professional standards, and they say this is the standard of care you can expect in an emergency department. Your individual organisation will have standards. Your professional organisation, your professional registration body will have standards that you must adhere to. I'm trying to think, there's some other standards. Anyway, so those standards, you can bring them in there, or you can just cover them off in the policy. Then the process we talked about, that's flow charts or process maps if you're an IT type or a project management type. Procedures, Marianne's going to talk you through those, and then guidelines about exactly how to do this, that, and the other. Now, I would have said props at that point, but guideline is a prop. You can have checklists, you can have risk assessments, you can have additional documents to open up that lead you on to a deeper assessment of a problem once it's been identified. Right, so why do we have policies? They are a bit of a tome at times, but they are a necessary tome. They state what the management of the organisation expects from its employees. And one of the things you'll find is if you don't know what your manager expects of you, it's a very unsettling place because you don't know when you might be getting into trouble next. You need to know what's expected of you to be able to perform well. If I don't know that I'm expected to spend 20 minutes tops assessing a patient, then I'll take however long I take. And that might be 2 hours. And then I'm getting a rocket because I'm not working fast enough. So some of the things you can put into a policy is we would expect assessment to be done in a rapid manner, no more than. You can say that, and that states what your employees can expect. Those policies provide core rules. Now, I don't know how many of you had the deep joy of reading a policy manual, or indeed how many of you have waded through your intranet to find the policy on this, that, or the other, to try and prove a point or to find out what the rules are. I suspect that the annual leave policy has been quite well thumbed just lately, making sure you work out whether you've taken enough, got enough, etc. So they provide the core rules, and because they're the core rules, they're not very specific to perhaps the things that you're going to do most of in your working life, but they're really helpful. So a quick scan of our intranet to see what policies were about. If I set aside the maternity policies, because maternity seem to have a policy with absolutely everything, there's a lot of big overarching policies. A lot of them are personnel, human relations, organizational policies. They tell you how much leave you can have, how to go through a disciplinary procedure, how to go through a grievance. So there's a disciplinary and grievance policy, and there's a recruitment policy. Trying to think, I saw all these things and thought, oh yes, there's a violence and aggression policy. So there are big overarching policies that set the rules for the whole organization, and then different parts of the organization might then choose to interpret them and make them procedural. Now, the other thing that's very common is they set the standard that employees and our organizations as a whole are judged against. So one of the jobs I get, and one of the jobs you will have to do too, is contribute to complaint responses. Now, it's very easy to be very defensive about complaints, but one of your greatest friends when answering a complaint is the policy. So dig out the relevant policy, read it. Did the staff follow policy? Yes, they did. Was the outcome bad? No, it wasn't. But you can now say, very sorry you had such an uncomfortable and unpleasant experience. However, having looked at what you've complained about against our policy, we can see that our staff followed the policy. But, fair point, this particular paragraph is not covered by our policy. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go back and revise our policy and take your point into consideration to amend our policy. So you can't criticize staff for following policy. If they followed policy, then that's what you want them to do. But you can find policy gaps. So you go through and it's like, oh dear, our policy takes us to that point. Then there's a gaping hole that doesn't cover what happened. So now what do we do? Well, firstly, we put our hands up and say, really sorry. The reason you had a rough time was because the staff had to try and work out what to do in the absence of some clear guidelines, some clear rules, a clear policy. Some complainants are very, very keen to see the policy. So I demand to see a copy of my notes and the policy. Okay, here you are. Now, if what's happened, if what's happened to them follows policy, then they as individuals are not at fault. And that makes a big difference. If you're the one facing a complaint, if you know it's not about you as an individual, it's about a system failure, a policy failure, then that's less difficult to deal with. Another reason we have policies is so that we show how our organisation is implementing the law. So I had an ombudsman decision arrive today. A patient's relative, I beg their pardon, had complained and was unhappy with our first response. So we had gone around the loop again and answered additional queries and wasn't happy again. So had complained to the Health Service Ombudsman. Right. The Ombudsman's decision worked through the law point by point. It was fascinating to read. It was very easy to read. It wasn't difficult. But the Ombudsman laid out the law and said, the trust has an obligation under this law to do this, this, and this. They did. I find no fault with the trust in this regard. Oh, that's good. Next section. This law says, we were talking about the mental capacity. He was talking about Mental Capacity Act at that point. The Mental Capacity Act says that you must make provision for assessing capacity in regard to decisions. And I can see from the evidence provided to me that this was done. I find no fault with the trust in this regard. So it was fascinating how we had followed our policy and we had followed law, but it was slightly disconcerting when you get a complaint in because you think, did we? Are we sure? And it was really, really lovely to see that come back and say, you followed the law. And that's what we require of you. We require you to follow the law and to follow your own policies. So it's really important that policies reflect the current law. You can't have out-of-date law being followed in policies. It doesn't go down very well. Once you've got all these policies together, I mean, you should have had it at induction, really. It's the syllabus for employee induction. And it does sort of collectively provide an employee manual. Now, I've got to be honest, I won't be reading all the maternity policies for our trust, but I do know a fair number of them quite well. I'm afraid, like many people, the ones I know best are the ones around personnel, human resources issues. I know the annual leave policy pretty well. I also know some policies that really affect me. So the safeguarding policies are under my aegis now. So I know those ones really, really well. And I know related policies well. I would be struggling with something like, I think I would struggle a little bit with the admission policy. What does the admission policy say about who can admit a patient and things like that? But I'm pretty good at the discharge policy. So those things affect the whole organisation usually. I'm just thinking of all the other policies I know quite well. Absconding patient policy, always a good one to know about. What do I do if I find a patient's disappeared? Because that's not straightforward and it differs trust by trust. So good policies are written really well. They're written in simple terms and the language is really, really clear. What you find with a lot of documents, if you're not very careful, is that people get quite convoluted about their language. They're trying to sound too clever. They want to sound like they really know it, and they want to sound like they've shoved in every jargon word they can think of. That's an error, because if you do that, other people don't understand what you mean. So you need to keep your English really, really crisp, really direct, no long sentences, no multiple clauses. Keep it nice and straightforward, so that there is no risk of people not following it. I defy any organisation to have every policy written that clearly. They're mostly not. The policies should have clearly defined processes and procedures attached. So you should be able to see what's attached. Every organisation has a slightly different template for how they do policies, but you should find that there will be directly related procedures or processes and associated documents. That'd be the checklists and the risk assessments, what have you. Sometimes they call them related documents. Doesn't really matter. Some people call them action cards. Action cards tend to be the procedure bit. It doesn't matter, so long as you've got those very clearly associated with the policy and the policy refers to them. So at this point, action card 3 should be followed, that sort of thing. So good policy should also be fair towards employees, and so consequently the approvals process for policies should always involve someone from human resources in that approval to make sure that employment law has been adequately covered and that nothing is being unreasonable and unfair. And it should be really easy to follow a policy. It shouldn't be, oh my goodness, I need it out in front of me. And I need to just read every step as I go along. That said, policies you don't use very often, that can be a very useful strategy to print it off your intranet, stick it under your nose and go, right, now that's what I've got to do. Off we go. So what are the benefits of a policy? If I'm trying to pitch to you that you're going to have to get over this and do some policy writing and get interested in them, what's the benefit of having a policy? Well, the first benefit is that it encourages us to be accountable, because we can see clearly laid out what it is we're supposed to be doing. And so I can be accountable to my boss that my work is in line with policy. I can be accountable to CQC, because believe me, CQC do love a policy. So I can be accountable to CQC, or if you're in Wales, I guess it's HEIW, or I can't remember Scotland and Ireland what your inspectorates are called, but the healthcare inspectors do love a policy. And if you can demonstrate you've got a policy and you're working to policy, then they're very happy with that, because that shows direct accountability from the member of staff to the organisation and from the board to the public. If you've got a policy, it's difficult to make mistakes. I'm often heard to say the important thing here is to make it easy for people to do the right thing. So if the policy makes it really straightforward and really easy, you'll just do the right thing. You've got to have read the policy, of course, but you will just do the right thing as you go along. Now, you might think, oh, really, Jeanette, that's straitjacketing and I don't really want that. No, well, you might not. But within the rules, there should be enough freedom for you to use your initiative a little bit. So you could do it this way, or you could do it that way, but you mustn't do it the other way. So you can weigh things up and maybe reorder things a little bit but there are certain things you won't do because that's outside the rules. And another thing I'm heard to say an awful lot of is you must set expectations. It's completely unreasonable to just leave staff to try and work out what you want and make it up as they go along. So let's set an expectation of how we want staff to behave, how we want staff to act. And if we do that, then 9 times out of 10, they will do what is expected of them and do it well. The downsides, of course, we've got to always go, well, what's the problem with policies? Why would I want to live without rules? Well, it can limit your creative thinking. So it can be a little bit difficult. If the rules are really, 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 really rigid, then you can end up doing stuff that you perhaps wouldn't choose to do if you were allowed to be a little bit more creative. So sometimes you're constrained by law. You haven't got a choice. You can't not do something because the law says, well, you can't, and that's that. But within the law, you can usually find ways to do things that will match to the patient you've got in front of you. Policies can be interpreted in different ways. So on the flip side there, you can have a policy that's too tight and limits creativity, or you can have a policy that's too loose and too open to interpretation. And if it's open to interpretation, then we can come a cropper quite quickly because you're not giving staff enough framework, then you're not giving them firm enough boundaries, you're not giving them enough scaffolding, whichever metaphor you prefer, just to hang what they're doing on. Speaking personally, I think the downside of policies is the review dates come around so flipping quickly. And you always know that there's an inspection due because, blow me, somebody from high up in the organisation will come around and go, your policy, you're the author, it's out of date, do something about it. Because the inspectors like to see that our policies are updated regularly and refreshed. There shouldn't be any policies lying around that are more than 5 years old. That would suggest to me that your policies aren't keeping up with law and they're not keeping up with current best practice. So where do you start with writing a policy? Well, you ask for the template. I guarantee you, I absolutely 100% guarantee you, every organisation you're working for has a policy template. They also have a procedure template. They also have a report template. So if you're ever asked to write a report, ask corporate governance for the template. But a template is a real friend because often the template comes from people who are passionate about getting this sort of stuff right. And they often do a guidance document with it. So your template arrives with lots of guidance and you just have to do what they tell you. And if you do what you've been told, as offered by the template, then you should manage to get a first draft down. Now, a first draft is just getting something written. It's not getting it right. So it's just a matter of fill it in and then we can start work with editing. The next thing you need to know, once you know you've got a template winging its way towards you, is what is the approvals process? So if I write this policy for you, what happens next? Do I just send it in and it gets uploaded onto the internet? Not a chance, never going to happen, not in a million years. You're going to find there's a lot of hoops. And so show off a bit, ask them, what's the governance structure for policies? Which governance structure should I be using for these approvals? So it depends who you've got and where you're seated in an organisation. But I would guess that you would have somewhere a senior staff meeting for emergency care. where the senior doctors and the senior nurses and the general manager all sit down and make decisions about how things are going to be done. So they will probably need to approve it. There may be a group above them that will need to approve it. And there will be in every organisation something called something like the Emergency Care Board. And they might have to approve it before it goes to the main policy approval process. Or you might get lucky. It might be a really straightforward, actually, so long as you've written down everyone you've consulted, you can send it straight through to the main policy approval group. Okay. But there might be quite a multi-step process to getting your policy approved, and it might get sent back to you several times with corrections. You also need to know what's the implementation process for a policy. So you've written your policy, you've got it approved. How do you then put it into action? How do you get everybody to do it? Are they expecting you to do the implementation as well as the writing? Are they expecting you to do the approvals process as well as the writing? What is being expected of you? And then the next thing, are you the right person to be writing this policy? So ideally, policies are not written by someone who's just started in the job. You need to know the organisation reasonably well. So usually it's folks who've been around a bit longer who are in a bit more senior position. It won't be new starters. Do you know the subject that you're being asked to write a policy on well enough? You might not, or you might have to just find out. And do you know who you need to consult? Okay, let's apply that. So we're going to look at what I was asked to do now. All right. Some years ago now, for my sins, I was asked to revise the rapid tranquilization policy. Thanks. Why me? Right. So working my way through what I've just told you to do, get the template, right? That's easy. You will have some function called policy administration or head of policy, something of that ilk. And you simply send them an email and say, please, may I have the current policy template? And they send it through to you with a lot of guidance in a zipped attachment on an email. They'll often provide the previous version as well. So if you're revising a current policy, as I was, they will send you through the current version, whatever that looks like, usually when you ask for the template. If you're having to do something completely new from a blank piece of paper, you will only need the template. So the approvals process, I was told, consult interested parties, get approval from lower governance groups, then present to Trust Policy Approval Group. Bit of a mouthful, generally known as TPAG at our place. So, consult interested parties. Rapid tranquilization. Who might be interested in rapid tranquilization? Well, clearly doctors, because they're going to have to prescribe. So clearly doctors, clearly nurses, because they're going to have to prepare and potentially administer the drugs. Okay. Who else? Well, anything to do with drugs, pharmacy will want to be involved. So who's the pharmacist that I need to ask for? Ask somewhere high in pharmacy and let them delegate you a pharmacist to work with. What sort of doctors do I need to consult? Well, clearly the A&E medical staff will have a view, and RChem helpfully have some guidance. So that's that bit. Well, who else does rapid tranquilization? Oh, funny old thing, the psychiatrists. So will the psychiatrists want to say something? Yes, they absolutely will. Right. Do we use rapid tranquilization on anyone under 18? Should we? Now we're going to have to ask the paediatricians and the child psychiatrists. Oh, this is going to be a fun discussion around a table. Maybe I won't consult them all at the same time. And what's my approval processes? Well, if I do have them in the room all at the same time, actually they could be my approvals process. But who would fish us out of a hole if rapid tranquilization went wrong? That would be the anaesthetists. So I better get approval from the anaesthetists, because we don't want them thinking they're going to have to pull people out of holes too frequently. We want them to be happy with what's happening and they don't have to run in on the white charger too often. Okay, so we'll have to get some sort of sign off from anaesthetics, some sort of sign off from psychiatry, some sort of sign off from child psychiatry, some sort of sign off from paediatrics and from pharmacy. Joy. And then with all of those approvals, off we go to the policy approval group. Great. Right, what's my implementation process? Oh, well, I was all right on that. Policy administration will deal with that. Oh, will they? Okay, fine. So they'll do the upload to the intranet. I don't need to worry about that. But there's perhaps some training involved. Okay, so then we have to look at who needs to be trained, when they need to be trained, how they need to be trained, how frequently, what's that about, and set something up around that. Did I know the organisation well enough? Yes, that was fine. I knew the policy writing process. I know the organisation well enough. Did I know the subject well enough? Honestly, probably not. I know it inside out and back to front now, but at the time, probably not. Was I the right person to author the policy? Probably not. So why was I chosen? Because the senior nurse who asked me to do it thought I would get the job done, and that I would just press on to the end. And in that, they were right. But I had quite a game getting there. Did I know who to consult? Well, I did know where to start, because I simply started with the people who'd written the last policy. And then I picked up leads from there. So you're now going to say, Jeanette, why didn't the people who wrote the last version of the policy do the revision? Well, because we nicked the previous version of the policy from our mental health colleagues, and we just tried to adopt their policy into our organisation. It didn't quite work. So it needed a bit of shaping up. But the people who'd written the mental health policy were clearly the people to start with, and then work my way around. And it is amazing how many people want to be involved in that. And the biggest thing we did actually was we changed the name of the policy. Coming on to that next section, so let's move on now. Having applied all of that to what I was asked to do, let's move on and let's look at some nuts and bolts bits of writing a policy. So on your policy template, you should have these sections. You should have some sort of header. That'll be your trust header, your trust logo. On my example later, I've deliberately left the logo off so as not to make it too identifiable as to which trust I've lifted it from. You'll have to have some sort of dates. That will be the date it was approved. It will also be the date it's due for review. And each organisation will have a time span for policy. Many of them are 2 years, some are 3, some are 5. It depends depends entirely on what the policy is about. Then a title. Now, we changed the title of the rapid tranquilization policy. And the reason we did that was because we got ourselves into all sorts of difficulties with the child psychiatrists, who argued that wanting to give lorazepam was not rapid tranquilization. It was PRN sedation. And we argued back that it wasn't PRN sedation because we didn't know the child. We didn't know anything about them, hadn't looked after them before, potentially. Certainly they weren't on other psychiatric medications that we might be aware of. And actually, we just wanted to calm down some difficult behaviour that was out of control before they arrived in the emergency department. And a very shrewd pharmacist sat there and said, well, it's not PRN sedation. It's not rapid tranquilization. It is emergency sedation. So now we call the policy the emergency sedation policy. And it isn't rapid tranquilization. And that has all sorts of benefits. The first is the child psychiatrists just went, yeah, that'll be fine. So from arguing really hard, they just went to, yeah, that'll be fine. The second benefit is actually the junior doctors are less scared of it because the junior doctors had some sort of image in their mind about rapid tranquilization that involved vets with rifles and darts and elephants, and then the elephant just falling over. And they've kind of got this image in their head. Emergency sedation just wipes that image. And it also changed the view from a psychiatric hospital of why would I be using a rapid tranquilization in a psychiatric situation to why would I be using it in a general hospital situation. And the reasons we have to do that are different between the different types of healthcare. So that change of title kind of made everything go, oof, amazing, very, very small thing to do. You'll also find in a policy that you have to have the authority's approval. So it'll all witter through that we went to this place and that place and these people were consulted and it was finally signed off by, so it documents the approval process. That's important really for chain of evidence. So for those of you thinking forensic stuff, it's like a chain of forensic evidence. Or for those of you more arty types, it's looking at the provenance of a piece of work. Where did it come from? Who contributed to it? Whose brush strokes are on it? Then a policy statement that says this is what it's about. Then a scope of the policy. So here's the limits of the policy. It, for the sake of argument, it won't be this. A policy only applies if you're in our premises. Then any lists of procedure numbers, and names of relevant procedures, some sort of statement of roles and responsibilities. So who's required to follow this policy and what are they required? What input are they required to make? And often you'll find that the most senior staff are named on every policy, and they're about making sure that the policy is followed. There has to be some sort of training needs analysis. If we're going to change this policy, do staff need to be trained differently? Do we need to include this in their induction pack? Does every member of staff need to know about this policy? Chances are no. There needs to be some sort of equality, diversity, impact assessment, purely because it's will any of the protected characteristics, as 10 characteristics protected in law that we have to have consideration for, would any of those be adversely affected by that policy? Yay or nay? And a good policy is straight down the line, nobody's adversely affected. Doesn't always work because obviously some policies are very specific to certain scenarios, and in those scenarios you may only find some characteristics. There has to be something about monitoring arrangements. Some policies are required by law or by other trust policies to be regularly reported and monitored. So that might be necessary. And at some point you've got to put the references in, so that you might be referring back to something. Another policy I had to write was a non-medical X-ray requesting policy. I've done that more than once. It's a fiendishly difficult policy to write. And sometimes you find it's in the overall policy is the imaging policy, and actually your non-medical bit is right down as just a procedure off the main policy, but nevertheless fiendishly difficult to do, just because there's vested interests at all levels. And so your references on a policy like that are absolutely critical to get those spot on. Now, how are you going to write this? Well, the first thing I want to talk to you about in writing, just putting finger to keyboard, is the font you choose. It's really important you choose what's called a professional font. Now, the font that we use at the Faculty of Emergency Nursing is Calibri. So all our slides should be Calibri, all our documents should be Calibri. And the reason we do that is because it doesn't have any extra curls and loops on anything. And that font is known for being easiest for people with sight impairments to read. So we always use Calibri. You'll find Arial is used a lot in NHS, or in the NHS full stop. Often you're required to write letters in Arial 11 point with headings of Arial 13 point. And so it's got to be Arial, not Arial narrow or anything else. Some places like Cambria, not all, but it can be an acceptable font. And Times New Roman is often requested by academic papers, academic journals, or academic tutors. So you often find that Times New Roman font size 12 is what is required by your tutor at university. So the reason, again, is because it's a very professional looking font. People who work in graphic design and communications have a bit of a thing going against Comic Sans. So that's fine, but you can see it looks a little bit like primary school teacher writing. So it wouldn't be appropriate to write a professional policy in that font, because the impression that font gives is of primary school, and it's not a helpful impression to give. And then I've picked out some other fonts you could be possibly tempted into. And again, you just have to look at them and go, do you know what, really? No, maybe not. So really important, you pick something from the first four, but you follow whatever your organisation says you've got to use. So if your organisation says Arial, you do it in Arial. If it says Times New Roman, you do it in Times New Roman. And you don't argue the toss, you just do it. Now, font sizes. You will find that your instructions say that headings have to be one size bigger than the main body of text. So very often you'll find that headings are size 14, and then the body of text font is smaller, usually size 12. Or with Arial, it's 13 and 11. But whatever your guidance with the policy template says, you follow. Now, why do you do it like that? It's because actually, if you don't, it looks a mess. So I've just written out a sentence for you there in a complete hodgepodge of font sizes and font types. And it's like, whoa. Now, if you think that that is something that never happens, let me assure you, it does. I was presented with a report into a very serious situation. I was presented with this report to read. And I kid you not, it looked like that sentence on my slide at the bottom there. I kid you not. I couldn't believe it. I knew that the person who was investigating had been paid to investigate, had been paid to write the report. And I was quite frankly appalled that that person could write like that. Because what does that tell me? That tells me they're not paying attention to detail. How the heck do you manage to get yourself in such a muddle? So now I actually don't trust the rest of your report. Now I don't trust the rest of your policy because you couldn't be bothered. And if you couldn't be bothered to get your formatting right, you couldn't be bothered to get your content right, I don't trust you. So really, really important you get it spot on. And if they say it's got to be 1.5 line spacing, justified, left aligned, whatever, you do it. So the rest of the formatting rules are usually black font on a white background, no color. Lots of color is discouraged in professional writing. The only time you might get away with color is lines on graphs or blocks on graphs. Don't go overboard with color. It doesn't go down well with a lot of people, and you can run into difficulties with people who are colorblind and different types of colorblind. So ease back on the color, white on black only. If you're about to say to me, Jeanette, what about people who are dyslexic? Well, a lot of people who are dyslexic will have a color filter that they use on everything, and you can't second guess what color they're going to be most comfortable reading. So just leave it to them to put their color filter over it. You do need to be really careful about the spaces between your lines, between your paragraphs, between your sections and your subsections. Often you set up your document before you start so that it is single line spaced or 1.5 line spaced, whatever's been specified. I would be very surprised if they want the policy in double line spacing, although your academic tutors at university will always want double line spaced because then it's easier for marking. But usually for a policy, single line spaced is perfectly adequate, but then you need to leave a deliberate gap between paragraphs and a double that between sections and potentially indent for subsections, whatever the guidance with the template says. And that's because if you get that set out correctly, then it's really easy for someone to jump from one section to the next when they're searching for a specific bit. My staff will tell you there's no excuses for bad SPAG. SPAG is spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Nicked the term from the head of English at my children's secondary school. It is now our shorthand for have you checked your work. I want no misspells, no bad punctuation, and please, 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 no exclamation marks in a policy. And use the grammar check function. That's the wiggly green line mostly when you're using word type documents. And you must write it in the third person. So it's not I, the first person, or you, second person, but in the third person. He will do this, she will do that, they will do the other. Right, that's quite a lot of instructions, and Jeanette being quite nitpicky. So how are we off for questions at that point? Okay, silence. Let's, in that case, have a break. And we'll take a 10-minute break now and then come back and apply what we've learnt to an operational policy. Oops, let's go back a slide there. Right. Okay, so suitably refreshed, rehydrated. Let's move on. Now, what we're going to do in this second half is we're going to apply what we were learning in the first half of the lecture to an operational department, and start that again, an emergency department operational policy. So what that policy says is how that emergency department is going to work. Okay, so has it got an introduction with some sort of policy statement? Yes, it has. Here we are. We have introduction and rationale. So this is the introduction to the policy, and it's explaining why the policy is needed. So the policy is designed to give clear operational guidance, right? So the aim of the person writing is that The guidance is for operations. That means day-to-day running of the show, not the kind of forward planning stuff, but the day-to-day nitty-gritty, how we're going to make today work. For the management of a particular hospital's emergency department. The operational policy has been written to identify the procedure for the triage and assessment of patients arriving. Oh, look, we haven't got the grammar and what have you perfect there. Identify the procedure for the triage and assessment of patients arriving in the emergency department is clear and precise. So let's make sure that is clear and precise, and for the overall management of the patients through the department. So there's quite a lot of emphasis at management level about that triage bit, getting the triage and the assessment. They're often terms that are used interchangeably by management, but as nurses and as doctors who work in emergency care, we're very aware that triage is the kind of quick prioritization, and assessment is a bit more in depth. A clinical assessment, working out what's wrong with you. What do we need to do to find out what's wrong with you? What do we need to do about it? So it's also, the policy is also there to improve the flow of patients from initial reception through to discharge or admission to a ward. So we want that to move ever onwards and just keep moving at a nice steady rate. Now, we all know it doesn't. It gets lumpy, and lately we've had all sorts of crowding problems and all that sort of thing. But what we're wanting to achieve, clear statement there, we want a flow of patients from reception to discharge or admission, depending which way we've decided they're going to go. We also want to ensure that all patients receive the care and treatment they need in the appropriate timeframes. So we haven't specified any particular group. We've said all patients need to receive care and treatment in an appropriate timeframe. And we also want, please, to enable the staff to work as a multidisciplinary team, enabling that care and treatment to all patients, however busy the department gets. Okay, so that's about everybody working as a team. And I think those of us who've worked in emergency care for a while know perfectly well that teamwork is how the whole thing exists. We don't have doctors who float in for a bit and float out for a bit, do a round and then leave us to it. They're there all the time with us. They're doing their bit of the work. We're doing our bit of the work. Our portering staff, our cleaning staff, our reception staff are all doing their bit of the work. And if any one of us are missing, the whole thing doesn't work as well as it does when all of us are there. And the management statement here is that they want to enable staff to deliver care in line with the Trust's values. Now, all of you will have values statements on your Trust headers. It comes up on all the Trust stationery. It's often on the PowerPoint templates, on the letters that are sent to patients. It's on many of the other things. Most healthcare organisations have something that says they care, something that says they listen, and something that says that we want to improve. So there's usually things around caring, listening, improving, excelling, that sort of thing in values statements. And those are often distilled down from bigger public consultation events. So once you've distilled what the values are that the Trust is supposed to be using, those, that's then, right, we want our staff to deliver on those values. So our policies must be in line with that so that we enable our staff to be kind, to listen, to care, to be gentle, whatever it is that we've said in the values that's important. Okay, next section. So the next section is, in this policy, is definitions. So as with any good lecture, we do have to define our terms. So this table is actually about defining some of the acronyms. So rather than get themselves hung up on writing everything out in full, you can see that what the policy author has done here is give you up front the acronyms that they're going to use and what that means. And then they've used the term ED crowding, emergency department crowding. What does that mean? It means the situation that we find ourselves in a lot of the time where the number of patients occupying the emergency department is beyond the capacity for the building design. Okay, we're all in buildings that were designed for less than we've got on the whole. I know our departments are building work ongoing. I have a feeling that when the building work's finished, we'll all go, whoa, gosh, that's a lot of space. And before long, give it 5 years, and we'll find that we're a bit pushed for space again. I remember when the current department felt like a flipping mansion. Doesn't now. Right, now here's our policy statement. This operating policy relates to the following staff groups who may be involved in the assessment and delivery of emergency care in the department. So, medical staff, registered nurses, HCAs. So it's really a bit focused there on medical and nursing, a bit less on reception staff, and not on general management. But that's a bit odd because we'll come on to the next bit. And this is just about the day-to-day running of the department for everything. So there's also, you can see, not otherwise covered in condition-specific or treatment-specific standard operating procedures. So there's something there about expect to find a guideline on how to treat a patient with asthma. Expect to find a guideline on how to treat a child with a DKA. So expect to find those, but this is the overarching policy of how we're going to make the place work. Okay. Now, roles and responsibilities. You'll remember that was in my list of things you had to do. Now, I've trimmed this back because this table was quite large in the policy, so I've edited it a bit and just focused on what is required of the ED staff. I haven't included what's required for bronze, silver, and gold command. You'll know what those are. If you don't, then may I recommend the MFEN lectures on major incidents. As part of your MFEN membership, you get access to the MFEN lectures as well. So MFEN are currently working their way through a set of lectures on major incident. And I think she says, referencing quickly, I have a feeling that they were doing communication this week. Yep. So this week, this Tuesday, they were doing communication structures. So Emma will have gone through what's bronze, what's silver, what's gold within your organisation. I've put at the top the senior groups. Now, in our organisation, emergency care is not a standalone thing. It's within a division. I expect that in your organisation, emergency care is not a standalone thing. It's part of a group or a division or a directorate or whatever word, however you're chopped up. For the organisation where this policy applies, the emergency department is clearly under medical division. So medical division leadership are required to do their bit. Unscheduled care leadership, so that's kind of a subsection of medical division, are required to do their bit. And there is an unscheduled care duty manager, so that will be the general manager on at the time, and then the on-call, there will be an on-call system for that. So they have responsibilities under this policy, which I deliberately left out because I thought you'd be more interested in what's required of the staff that work there all the time. So the consultants and the coordinator have to be familiar with the policy and ensure the hourly safety boards are completed every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The nursing staff, medical staff, and administration staff, interesting that they make it into this one, but didn't make it into the previous slide, which was the policy statement. And they are to be familiar with the policy and its contents and recognise the actions that they may be requested to take as a result. Okay, That's a slightly worrying statement, which means you better have read the whole of this policy. Right, so next section. It's interesting because I find our policies tend to be, section 5 is the bit you actually need to read. And on this policy, it's section 5 as well. So move my screen out of the way so you can see. So section 5, the management of the emergency department, right? How are we going to do it? The coordinator and the consultant in charge are in charge of the day-to-day running of the shop floor, supported when required by the unscheduled care matrons, the general manager, and the specialty director. Right, so what that tells me is that the 3 most senior people in unscheduled care, the matrons, the general manager, and the specialty director, are not supposed to be involved in day-to-day running of the show. You would expect them to be outside the day-to-day running. So the coordinator is going to be someone who's a band 6 or 7. If you're under Agenda for Change stuff, if you're over in the Republic of Ireland, that's a CNM 1 or a CNM 2 taking the coordinator role. And then the consultant in charge, there'll be various acronyms for that. At our place, it's known as the EPIC. Haven't got a clue what that means. Emergency physician in charge, I think it might be. Where's the EPIC? Right, which consultant's on today? Then there is a middle grade emergency department doctor or consultant present in the emergency department 24 hours a day. Good, that's helpful. The coordinator has responsibility for flow. That's really helpful. So the coordinator's responsibility is keeping the flow moving. That's not the consultant's responsibility. Doesn't mean the consultant's allowed to frustrate the coordinator or vice versa, but it's the coordinator's lead responsibility to keep flow moving. The coordinator facilitates flow, liaising with site management team. Okay, so that's interesting, isn't it? It's the coordinator who should be liaising with the site management team, not the rest of yous. So the rest of yous, get on with your job and let the coordinator do the liaising with site management. And together with the consultant in charge, is responsible for maintaining safety and high quality care. Okay, so this is a joint consultant and coordinator responsibility. We want no patient safety incidents and we want quality to be spot on. Must be right, must be according to guidelines as an absolute minimum. The majors coordinator, so now here we are, we're sectioned off now, we're coming into, oh, hang on a bit. The majors coordinator together with the identified senior clinician, okay, so it might be the consultant in charge, but it might actually be the middle grade doctor that is on, who's working on majors, our responsibility for completion on the hourly safety board round. Okay, so that tells me that the policy requires that the coordinator and the senior doctor around are to get together, heads together every hour and make sure they've completed the safety board round and they've picked up any safety concerns and they've had a chance to do a bit of a situational update. SIT rep in military terms or Department of Health returns terms, that they've looked at the situation and they've picked up what the safety issues might be, and mitigated for them. They've picked up where we might have some emerging risks. We've picked up where the flow's blocked, and we're not leaving it every 4 hours. We're doing it every hour so we don't get stuck. Then, as we go on through section 5, section 5.1, and we're starting then into subsections. So 5.1 through to, I can't remember how many we got there, something like 5.414. So they go through then explaining what you will do if you need to escalate. Now, escalate always means tell the person above you and see if they can nudge the person that's equivalent to them in the area you're having a bit of bother. Works a treat a lot of the time. We're always encouraged to escalate if we need to. But in emergency department context, escalating means I've got too many patients in my department, and I'm now going to start distributing some of them around the hospital so that the pressure on this department eases and the risk level held by this department reduces. Because, you know, if you have 80 patients in a department designed for 40, you're a bit tight for space, and everything becomes riskier. Section 5.2, emergency department crowding. Little bit of a statement on the fact that it's proven to cause increases in horrible things like mortality, morbidity, serious incidents, clinical errors, drug errors. And then what you're going to do about that. 5.3, essential care. Oh, interesting. So that comes in at 5.3, that it's really important that while we're in the department, everybody must have all their risk assessments completed. They mustn't acquire pressure ulcers. They mustn't acquire DVTs. They mustn't pick up infection from the person next to them. So really important that all of that care is delivered, that patients are fed, watered, toileted, pressure is relieved, and those simple things are really well catered for and looked after. They make a big difference to patients and relatives. 5.4, breaches. What are we going to do about breaches? We know the 4-hour breaches are going to happen. What do we do with that? How do we report it? What codes are we going to use against it? Why? 5.5, the duties of reception, how reception should function, the boundaries that they work within. 5.6, patient assessment, and that's split into ambulatory, walk-in, and ambulance patients, speaks for itself. 5.7, see and treat. When might I operate see and treat? Who may I put into the see and treat stream? How might I just switch from triage to see and treat or not? And then what do I do about expected patients? Do they go to the emergency department or do they not? Now, I did notice that this policy is a little out of date. It should have been reviewed, I noticed, in 2021, and it wasn't. I suspect pandemic is to blame, because I know in my organisation, we've got a lot of policies that are out of date, because what they did during COVID was they just went, add 2 years to whatever the review date was, and we'll sort it out when we've cleared up the urgent stuff. So expected patients may well be going to your SDEC area now, so your same day emergency care area. We seem to have gone a little bit further than ambulatory emergency care to the AEC to actually, do you know what? We need a surgical assessment for the GPs. We need a hot clinic to see the acute physicians for the GPs. We need a trauma or orthopedic, well, it's usually trauma, isn't it? But an orthopedic kind of hot clinic option as well. So actually we need urgent referral areas for expected patients rather than putting them in with the emergency patients. 5.9, referrals and reviews. So how are we going to refer? Who's going to refer? When are patients going to be reviewed? Who by? How many reviews do patients have to have? When do I call for a review? 5 point, lost track what I'm up to, but decision to admit. Now I've added this bit. Of course, it's now got to be called clinically ready to move or clinically ready to progress, isn't it? Got that wrong. Clinically ready to progress. And I know we're going over to that tomorrow. Instead of decision to admit, we're not going to talk about D2A times anymore. Yes, DTA anymore. We're going to talk about CRTP, clinically ready to progress, which means ready to go out or up or in or whatever. Then next section is on how we're going to admit and discharge from the emergency department. Next section on subsection on our relationship with imaging and pathology. How are we going to order tests? Who will review the test results? Will we get priority over the routine testing? Yes, please. those sorts of things. Are we going to have an imaging area that's just for emergency department patients? Yes, please. Are we going to have dedicated CT scanner time? Yes, please. Those sorts of things. Then agency and locums and how we're going to deal with that, and then safeguarding children and vulnerable adults and making sure we don't mess up there. So the essential care and the safeguarding, really, really important. And none of this has anything to do with what is wrong with the patient and why they came. So this is what you can do for everybody. Section 6 then, communication. So this document and the information contained herein will be available in the department. Okay, good, glad to know it. Where? So you would expect to find in your department somewhere that you've got a policy file. Now, for those of you who are completely paperless, you probably have it on the desktop of each PC or each computer on wheels that you've got, or each pad device. There will be a shortcut to policies, and ping, there it opens, so you've got it. Those of you who still have paper folders, you might well find that there is a policy folder that someone has been tasked with printing off a copy of every relevant policy, and it's all in there, well thumbed very often in poly pockets, very often with annotations on it going, no, don't do that, do this. Or you might find you have to look things up on your intranet. One of our consultants is responsible for maintaining what they call the ED guidelines. And there, once that comes down, you'll find there's an awful lot of policies are directable to that way, but also a lot of obviously clinical guidelines. How do you look after that person with asthma? How do you look after that child with a DKA? How do you organise theatre for someone with a fractured shaft of femur? Those sorts of things, all likely to be in your ED guidelines. So very, very important, you know where you find ED guidance or ED policies. Most emergency care areas will have that available on the internet. If not, then every healthcare provider on their intranet has a policies section, often called the policy library, and you can just go into the policy library at a convenient moment and look things up. Some of you will have intranets that have things set up so you can just click on it. The policy is on the intranet, yes, in the policy library, but you'll have a helpful hyperlink from your place of work going, this is the policy you need to look at. So that when it's changed, it's only changed in one place in the policy library, and all links still work. So here's a review arrangement here. In addition, it will be discussed at least 2 times per annum in the emergency department operational meeting and in the emergency department performance meeting. Okay, so that's potentially 4 times a year this is going to be discussed. Are we still doing the right thing? Is this okay? Is this policy still meeting our needs or not? And familiarisation with the document will form part of the ED induction programme. Okay, so that means that the practice development staff and the doctor, the consultant with current responsibility for inducting new doctors 4, 5, 6 times a year, whenever they all pitch up at different intervals, and indeed the reception manager and potentially the administration manager who looks after the secretaries, all will have to make sure that they're familiar with the policy and make sure that new staff are given the policy to read before they get going. Training. You have to have a training needs analysis attached to any policy, and they've copped out on this one. All emergency department staff members must make themselves familiar with this document and the actions they're required to take. There is no specific training. I.e., I'm not going to stand at the front of the room and tell you. I'm just going to say, there is an operational policy. This is where to find it. I expect you to read it, and I expect you to follow it. And that's as difficult as the training gets for this. Obviously, there's more complicated training for all sorts of component parts, but for the overall overarching operational policy. It is simply just read it and do it. And then there's a monitoring of compliance section. Standard question you'll find on a policy: do the systems or processes in this document have to be monitored in line with national, regional, or trust requirements? No. Marvellous. End of. Now, if the answer to that question had been yes, then monitoring arrangements would have to be listed beneath that. And then obviously around that, you've got references and what have you. So I've deliberately left off the title of the policy and the name of the trust, because that's not fair. But you get the general idea of what you might expect in that policy. And you should find that every single one of you has an operational policy for your area. So homework, find it, read it, follow it, and make sure that you're really clear what is expected of you is what you deliver. You might find a few surprises in it, but I sincerely hope you already know it well. So, what should we be able to do by the end of the lecture? Well, I hope you now have a better understanding of the function and the purpose of policies. Could you work out what they're there to do, and does it anywhere in them say, and if you're writing one, can you make it really explicitly clear? I hope you now have a better understanding of the benefit of having those policies. It saves people having to second guess. If they don't have to second guess, they will just perform to the standard that is expected of them. We've gone through some real fine detail, nuts and bolts, on writing a good policy. And you might think, Jeanette, this is really a bit dry, a bit tedious. I'm not that keen. I'm going to dodge writing a policy. I assure you, if you stay with a career in emergency nursing and you progress to the next level, you will be required to do the policy writing bit. So do feel free to come back to this lecture at a later date and go, do you know what? I need to just re-listen to that. What was I supposed to do? Oh yes, get the template. We've gone through, as I say, in some very minute detail, how to write a good policy. We've talked a little bit about introducing a policy. So I talked a little bit about how in my experience, moving through the being asked to revise the rapid tranquilization policy, which then morphed seamlessly into the emergency station policy, and all the steps involved in that. That's part of introducing it, and then up on the website, and then the training, and then you've got the induction element, so that on the induction list of things you must read is whatever your policy is that you've got to do. And then, of course, there's what are you going to do if someone breaches policy? Well, that's an adverse incident if someone does not behave to policy. If you find you can't follow policy because something stops you following policy, then it's useful to report as an adverse incident anyway, because what you're saying there is, I tried to follow the policy, but the policy didn't cater for the situation I was in. And so I had to make it up a little bit. Always dangerous to make things up, but if you report it in as an adverse incident, they can record as an EMS, and then policy can be amended to reflect the fact that this didn't quite work. And then we've also talked a little bit about policy, the problems that arise due to lack of a policy. Really, it's quite interesting watching people who don't know what to do. Everything kind of comes to a halt and people go, what am I supposed to do? How does this work? What do we do now? And some bright spark will say, what does the policy say? Right, we'll get the policy out. So we get the policy out and we have a look. And we find that very annoyingly, the policy is totally silent, just at the bit we needed it to be loud. Problem. Complaint comes in. What's your policy? Haven't got one. Right, we haven't got one. That's why there is an issue. And that lack of a policy is a real problem for a lot of places. So not having some guidance for staff is the bottom line here. No guidance, guaranteed problem. So thank you very much. Those of you who are on the call, just feel free to scan that QR code. Those of you who are listening on catch up, at the end of the video, a QR code comes up and you just need to scan that and that'll take you through to the evaluation form. When you've completed your evaluation form and hit submit, about 10 minutes later, you get a little billy-do in your inbox saying you've attended, you've watched the whole thing, well done. And then you'll get a separate communication with a copy of your evaluation, because as part of the evaluation, we ask you what are you going to do with this information? How are you going to implement it? And so the point of that is to give you some instant reflection to add to your revalidation portfolio, or indeed your FEN portfolio, and just put that in and go, okay, so that evidence is that I have learnt something from this video. I have thought about it, and this is how I've used that information. Well, this is how I intend to use this information, and I can come back later and say I did or I didn't. So there is a monthly webinar next week, obviously on on Thursday next week there is a monthly webinar, but there is no MFEN lecture the following week, and then there is an assessor webinar, but no MFEN again until the 24th of April, when we'll be doing the next step in this series, which is writing a procedure, or writing a standard operating procedure, and Marianne Jenkins will be leading that. The lecture after that is on Thursday, the 12th of May, which I'm sure you're all well aware is Nurses' Day, and I'm delighted to say that we've got Professor Brian Dolan coming to lecture to us that day on the art of negotiation. So I feel very, very honoured that we have had Gary Jones last week talking to us about the art of delegation, a lecture I can thoroughly recommend to you if you haven't already listened to it. And then next month, we've got Professor Brian Dolan coming to talk to us about the art of negotiation. And Brian is, as many of you may know, an excellent negotiator. So thank you very much indeed for your attention, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.